The Vatican has made a ruling on a Marian apparition. Kind of came and went. Nobody noticed this because of the political news. J.D. Vance versus the Vatican, right? Because of Francis's health. Between those things, Catholics across the West are paying attention. Because you may have noticed when J.D. Vance went to Germany and spoke at that Munich conference, it dominated the news on every platform. Even Catholic outlets were like talking about it, partially because he invoked John Paul II, as I showed you yesterday. The Vatican ruled on a Marian apparition and deemed it to be fraudulent. Now, again, we live and labor into the diabolic disorientation of the church, where we don't trust the authorities in Rome very much. Most people don't, even the biggest supporters of Francis. And, well, if you get them speaking candidly about things, they admit they don't trust the authorities in Rome, and for good reason. But they have made a ruling here. So we go to Info Catholica. If I can find my link to it. Let's try this again. We go to Info Catholica for this headline. The tears of the Virgin, in, quote unquote, in Trevignano were from the false visionary. I often get comments from people. Oh, you should believe that. Here's a quote from my Jesus, from some mystic who has been essentially warned against following by their bishop and ignored by Rome. And when you look at the person, it's not hard to tell that they're probably either something wrong with the person or that there's what's going on, what they're purporting to be happening isn't happening, and it's something else. And I always caution people about following contemporary mystics, contemporary visionaries, because oftentimes the contemporary ones are these ongoing decade-long events, multi-decade-long events, when the apparitions of Our Lady that the church has approved and the work of mystics. Yeah, sometimes like Blessed Aunt Catherine Emmerich has these things that happen off and on for many years, but they're not like a weekly thing. If you go read her diaries, they weren't exactly happening every single day. But oftentimes with these essentially grifters trying to lead people astray for their own personal profit, they do it in a way that is almost like constant with these messages, alleged messages from heaven. In this case, there was a statue of the Virgin that had tears coming down. And it turned out that the tears were not what they were purported to be. Details from the article, quote, since 2016, Cardia claimed to have received apparitions of the Virgin Mary, Jesus Christ, and God the Father, an apparition of God the Father, there's another red flag, in this town located northwest of Rome. Her followers regularly gathered in acts of public prayer, the statue of the Virgin as the central element, which on occasions showed what Cardia described as miraculous tears of blood. The visionary always maintained to her followers this phenomenon was of divine origin. The church banned worship for this in 2024. The growing following around Trevignano led the church to intervene. Following an investigation, the bishop responsible decreed in March of last year the prohibition of any type of religious celebration, both public and private, at the site of the alleged apparitions. This measure included the suspension of masses, prayer meetings, and pilgrimages in any order to avoid any impression of ecclesiastical recognition. A few days later, the Vatican officially confirmed that no supernatural events occurred in Trevignano. At the same time, the visionary has been the subject of judicial investigations. According to reports in the Italian press, some pilgrims have denounced Cardia for alleged fraud and illicit enrichment, demanding the return of donations made. As part of these investigations, a DNA analysis was carried out on the tears of blood, confirming that the biological substance belongs to the alleged seer himself. Here's their confirmation from a year ago, almost, about 7 months ago. I did an earlier report from Info Catholica with the headline, Doctrine of Faith confirms the alleged apparitions of Trevignano are not supernatural. And they confirmed it before they had the physical evidence, but when they do the DNA test on the blood and it turns out to match perfectly the person, the seer, you've got a pretty open and shut case at that point. And I hate to say this, it's all too many cases like that. It's why I always hesitate to do videos on the latest Eucharistic miracle, because sometimes the Eucharistic miracle that's being alleged turns out to have been that a host was found in a place exposed to moisture or something that caused mold to grow on it, or other things. And it turned out to not be what it is purported to be. But sometimes they are what they purport to be. Oftentimes, alleged miracles are not miracles at all. And this has been the church's standard for a very long time, well predating Vatican II. to always look for a material answer to what alleged happening is happening, to make sure that people don't get taken by something that was just a pure coincidence, or in this case, fraudulent activity. Not to fall for every con artist who comes along. That has been the church's standard, because I have told people this before, that it would not, if you know the messages of Our Lady pretty well, it would not be that hard to fabricate a Marian apparition. If you look at the Marian apparitions out there, all the proved ones, the seers are the only one involved, are the only ones who you typically see the Virgin. And if you know previous Marian apparitions well, it would not be hard to fabricate a message. I highly recommend you don't do that. If you're playing with sulfur if you do that, to purposely put false words into Our Lady's mouth, into the mouth of heaven, because she comes bearing messages from heaven. She doesn't, as far as my understanding is, does not come to seers and just on her own volition, but she comes bearing messages from the Father and from her Son. So to put fake messages in her mouth is a terrible idea. But it wouldn't be hard to do if you know the approved messages. And some of the ones that aren't approved but aren't banned either, because most of the time Rome ignores alleged Marian apparitions. I've done videos on a whole bunch of these different ones that where the local bishop seemed to like it, but Rome never talked about it one way or the other, never looked at it. But there's always a consistent theme in all these Marian apparitions. And it wouldn't be hard to fabricate one. And that person with the tears of blood from the statue went a little over the top. Because you don't have to, once you start bringing in material evidence, you start running into a serious problem where you start bringing in scientific investigations. And so finding a DNA match between the tears of blood flowing from the eyes of a statue of the Virgin Mary and the seer being connected directly to it is a bit much. Sloppiness. But thankfully, remember, what is the queen of all sins? The one that enables everything else. Why I call it the first deadly sin, and that's pride. It's what pride goeth before the fall. So if you're going to fabricate a Marian apparition and Marian messages and things to personally enrich yourself, you're probably going to have because sin darkens the intellect. I can't think of anything worse than to put words into the mouth of heaven. Then it's probably not going to occur to you that they're going to do a scientific test on things to make sure that your claims are accurate. All right, folks. Raven Ray says, Google the Agao apparitions in the northern Philippines. That was also disproved. Right. There's a lot of them. Men attempts. This has been actually something the Vatican has commented on in the past, actually, is that after Vatican II, you had just a whole, it seemed like a cottage industry of false Marian apparitions. Call it the diabolic disorientation taking on a new life, which brings me back to an earlier point. We know Leo XIII had an allocation, a vision, a mystical experience where he was privy to a conversation between God and Satan. Satan bragging to our blessed Lord that he could destroy the church, that he needed a century. We don't know when that century began. Jesus said, you will have that power, you will have that time. Some believe that century began somewhere around the Fatima message. Does that mean the century is up? Or that it didn't start until a few years later? We don't know. We'll all find out. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments, please. Philip says, I see many quotes from Catholics from condemned prophecy, even from blesseds and saints. This is why I really get annoyed when people start putting messages in my comments. Oh, from some contemporary thing. Don't follow contemporary mystical experiences. Or if you do, read them with a gigantic grain of salt. I'm not saying they don't happen, but you have to use careful discernment. And this is why the state of the magisterium of the church these days, it's one of this pile of reasons that it's so concerning, because people intuitively don't really trust what comes out of Rome so much anymore. And so they then use their own authority, interpretive authority, to say, well, I trust this, even though the local bishop has said not to do this, or they've ignored it, or whatever. Okay, truth. Bye now. That Bible does not say that, and we don't do idols, truth, so whatever. Bye now. Anyway, I have a zero tolerance policy for Protestants coming into my comment section and trying to lead people out of the faith, or spouting their bizarre nonsense. And we just had another encounter of that. Anyway, folks, thanks very much for tuning in today. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.